Well, on the sidelines of the World Economic Forum in Dalian, CNA's Olivia Xiong spoke to an economist who says the planned reforms at the third plenum may not fully address the country's sluggish economy in the short term. Well, she also weighed in on the overcapacity debate and tells us where China-US relations may be headed.
First of all, the concept of overcapacity is a little bit misplaced, I think. You know, when a country exports something, they are, by definition, producing more than they're consuming. So we don't say U.S. has an overcapacity in soybeans, for instance, even though it exports soybeans. But I think even if there were an overcapacity issue, let's say with Chinese EVs, I think it is a temporary phenomenon because China starts an industrial policy, starts a new sector. Of course, there's a lot of capacity in the beginning, but then the market takes over, and market mechanisms means that there's a lot more competition, and they will kind of drive down some of the number of cars and capacity and all that. But still, we're talking about 45 million EV vehicle demand to help us stay on the green transition by 2040. Who's going to produce that? I don't see an overcapacity when it comes to new energy products.
You said that this is a temporary thing, but are there going to be long-term effects? We already see the tariffs, but are there going to be long-term implications?
I just don't agree with the tariff wars that have now fallen on renewables and EVs and batteries and so forth, because this is a common global challenge for all of humanity. We don't have enough of that. The cost is not low enough. We don't have enough investment in renewables. For every dollar that the U.S. spends on renewable investment, China spends 3. We actually should encourage more investment in these sectors and much less protectionism in these areas. And finally, this is all part of a global supply chain. Yes, China might be leading in solar panels and EVs, but it's deeply embedded in a supply chain that's going to involve lots of participants. And I think that China should do more. For instance, following on its trajectory, investing more in Europe, directly in plants and battery plants and EV plants, and collaborating with all European countries to jumpstart their platform for EVs. I think that would be good for the world, be good for Europe, China-Europe relations, and it'll help us to jumpstart new strategic industries that are so critical for the structural transformation underway.
We're expecting the third plenum coming up here in China, where the economy is going to be in focus. Do you expect any adjustments because of these latest developments to surface at this important meeting?
I think the third plenum will be very specific about the plans for the next few years on not only on focusing on the high-tech sectors that we have been talking about, because I think the leaders do believe that new productive forces, transition to higher quality, ascending the value chain is critical for the Chinese economy. We're going to see more specific details about plans and reforms and so forth, but I think we also need to be realistic, right? These are really important goals to pursue, but it doesn't necessarily solve the short-term problems in the Chinese economy. Aggregate deficit in demand, employment pressures, wage growth pressures, only that can actually, only when that's harnessed can there actually be realistic consumption increases. And so in the short term, there needs to be short-term solutions. The long term is long term. It doesn't substitute for the short-term issues, and you just need to have both. So I'm hoping that there will be more announcements of stimulus packages for the short term.
At the same time, though, we've seen Chinese officials continually try to make the pitch that, as you mentioned, China is open to the world, but it's also how that is being received. Do you think there are misperceptions as to China's economic policy, and how do you think that should be addressed?
There's huge misperception issues, especially onto China, between China and the West and many others, and maybe the Chinese misperception of the U.S. as well. So this is why I think this communication, keeping the dialogues open, effective communication is so critically important. I think there's a cultural difference that we all need to be more aware of. You know, if we only take one lens to look at very different countries, we're going to come up with very different interpretations and different projections. But also, I think it would be in China's interest to be more transparent about what it's doing, its plans, its trajectories, its reforms, and also communicate more effectively that China's goal is not about anything to do with the U.S. China's goal is about itself, to be China's best, to make the best for Chinese people, and effectively communicating that as the goal would potentially suspend some of the misgivings.
At the same time, though, we know that that's what's happening here in China, but we see the U.S. also with the Inflation Reduction Act also talking about putting in subsidies to support its industries to be more competitive. There have been some people who say that this is not very different from what China is doing. What is your take on that?
I think that I have a very different take on the race of industrial policies, if you will. And this is not just the Chips and Science Act, but European Green Deal and UK, Japan, all trying to bring their A game. I don't think it's a bad thing to bring their A game for all countries, because in the end, competition is going to be good for consumers. Now, one of the things I have mentioned is that there's a striking fact in the U.S. economy, which is a decline in competition, rising concentration levels. So more concentration is better. If the government can get their act together to put in the necessary infrastructure to help the transition to the green economy, that's a good thing. But I think that the race is really not in subsidies. I think that would be a race to the bottom, and I think that tariff wars are really highly unproductive, but innovation policies to strengthen one's own an innovative capacity that will benefit ultimately the consumers is a good thing.
At the same time, though, China has, when asked about its thoughts on the U.S. election, has maintained that it has no part in the U.S. election. But do you think on the Chinese government part that they will already be planning for adjustments or tweaks to their policy or approach to the U.S. depending on who wins the election?
Honestly speaking, I think it's already become a normality psychologically in terms of policies for the Chinese government to be prepared that either presidential candidate now and going in the future is not necessarily going to be super collaborative with China. I think they have already adjusted years ago when they are already convinced that that is a new future trend. But these things need to be managed, right? Both countries need to exercise restraint. Even if we're not optimistic that there's going to be more convergence, we need to make sure there's no divergence, even if it's moving in parallel. But all of that requires effort, requires management. And I want to emphasize that China has been exquisitely exercising a certain amount of restraint, and that needs to continue. And U.S. needs to be careful not to push the buttons too far on a variety of security issues. And if both sides, whoever the presidential candidate is, have rational policy advisors around them to uphold this constraint, I think we're already hoping for the best.